Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Tuesday, the 11th of October of 2022. This is I don't know if we call it a subcommittee. It's more of a work group or a sub-task group on the funding aspects of the House Bill 3000 task force. Why don't we first start by just kind of going around and getting everybody to introduce themselves, and then we can start talking numbers and what our task is. So I'll start myself. I'm Rob Ovett. The chair kind of assigned me to kind of lead us through this little discussion and adventure. I'm employed by Washington County, but I also teach drug policy at Lewis and Clark Law School. So got a long history of working on drug policy here in Oregon. So that's me. Why don't we go to Amanda next, and then you call out the next person, Amanda.
Sounds good. Amanda Borup. I'm a policy analyst with the OLCC. And Brent, you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry about that. I'm having a little trouble where I'm at. Brent Kenyon, Kenyon Associates Consulting. Been in cannabis 25 years, worked a lot with OLCC and other agencies on these things, and glad to be here to lend a hand.
And let's go to maybe Ryan Keck next, because he's on my screen.
Good morning, everybody. Ryan Keck, Criminal Justice Commission, and the Programs Director here. So I oversee the grant programs to include the illegal marijuana market enforcement grant. Ken?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Sanchgren. I'm the Executive Director here at the Criminal Justice Commission, and I'll flip it over to Ann.
Looks like Ann may have stepped away, because I think we have a picture of her.
That's true, of her outlet, yeah. So why not Ferdy?
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Ferdy Ruplin. I'm an attorney at Tonkin Torp, and appreciate everybody's time. I guess I'll pass it on to Elena. Or anybody else that wants to jump in.
Yeah, we're down to a few left. So, and folks don't have to introduce themselves if they don't want to. But I see Anthony Taylor is there, and I've got the names down. So, all right, open for anybody else that wants to introduce themselves. If not, I'll just march down with our agenda. All right. Well, again, I'm Rob Ovett. I'm kind of leading us here. I'm not sure I'm a chair of anything, but leading this discussion here to report back to the full task force on the 21st. I sent out an email to those from the task force that were kind of invited to this meeting, but I know there's others that weren't on that email chain that are here. And so I probably ought to just kind of summarize what I sent out to folks. Historically, the funding level has been, well, if you just add it all up, has been $31 million. That's essentially what the legislature allocated for the three different buckets. $20 million for the enforcement grant program that Ken Shop runs, CJC runs, another $6 million for the victims assistance grants that we heard a lot about. Really great information at our last full task force meeting, and Ken Shop also administers those two grants. That's $6 million, and then or $5 million, yeah, $6 million, and then we also got an additional $5 million for additional water masters that went directly to the Water Resources Department. So that was the legislative monetary allocation the last go around, and so that's what we're operating under right now. Now, keep in mind, Ken and I asked for twice that, but we got 20, which is good, but we had grant requests for nearly twice what we were able to give out. So there's a lot more need out there than we had money to actually grant out to deal with some of these challenges. We actually, a different group of people were asking for upwards of $8 million for the victims assistance side. I initially asked for 4, and then it got accelerated to 8, and they settled on 6. And I think we got a couple, from what it sounds like, we got a couple of really great grantees gearing up to provide these services all around the state of Oregon. So that's great. I haven't heard much about the water master side because I haven't been participating in the water subcommittee of the task force, and maybe Amanda or someone else who can maybe mention how the $5 million is working. I have heard anecdotally that they've hired more water masters, and that water masters are actually visiting people, which I know came as a surprise to many folks. So I think these programs are either up and running or gearing up to run pretty fast here. So our task, as I understand it from the chair of the House Bill 3000 task force, is to come up with what we want our ask to be for the next full legislative session, which begins really in February of next year. So again, our starting point is 20 million for the enforcement grant side, and as I mentioned, that just wasn't enough. 6 million for victim services and 5 million for additional water master services. So I'd be really interested in hearing what other folks think about what the appropriate numbers ought to be, what we ought to be asking for. I know it's almost cart before the horse right now because we don't have all these fully up and running, but we've got to address this, sooner or later. So who wants to start the conversation with that background? Looks like Ken's got his hand up. Go ahead, Ken.
Sure, and I have to admit, there's been the last few HB 3000, the larger task force meetings I've not been able to get to, so maybe this is an item that we've already covered. But in addition to the funding that you mentioned, Rob, we do have the 6 million that is the kind of standard amount that was passed at the. So for that historical background, we used to have $3 million available for grantees through marijuana taxes. And then that was up to 6 million in HB 3000. And then in addition to that, there was the 31 million that Rob was mentioning. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because I know that when Ryan and I have been putting together our numbers, we've not been counting the water master funds. And so we think of it as 32 million, but that would be 32 million in total grant funding for CJC for this biennium. And then the 5 million was separate for the water master. So I just want to make sure we were on the same page.
That's a good point, Ken. I didn't talk about the baseline funding for IMM EGP, which has been around since 2015 or 16. It's been a while, so we need to add that in. So really, you got to look at it from that perspective as 26 and 6. So you're right, 32. Yep. 32 is just baseline, and that's what we ought to be talking about in the IMM EGP, the 2 buckets, and in addition to the 5 million of water masters, if we're just going to maintain status quo. That would be our baseline minimum ask, as Ken described. Representative Morgan's got her hand up.
Thank you, Rob. So a couple things we should be looking at what the ask was from all the applicants, not what was actually given by the legislature. And most of the applicants were told, since it's biennium, take your stuff. And they need it. You can't just hire somebody for 1 year. You can't hire a law enforcement officer. Their training's a minimum 18 months probation. So with a 1-year funding, we're told, hey, take what you were given and spread it out on multiple years. So I don't think it is enough. I don't think 50 million maybe would cover it, but it's one of those things that it certainly can't be just by what was given by the legislature right now, because we've overwhelmingly heard in the task force from law enforcement, it didn't cover their need, and it doesn't cover their ability to hire if it's not sustained beyond 1 year.
Yeah, and I hear you, Representative. Our original proposal was to actually expand so if I could, by way of further clarification, just so everybody knows how this is all functionally worked, the original IMM EGP, the original grant program administered by the CJC that Ken referred to, that had that kind of what I call 6 million baseline, that actually comes off the top of marijuana taxes. I call that the skim, which doesn't sound very good, but it really does. It comes off the top, always has. And so that provided a level of stability for that funding because it was dedicated. But the allocations that I mentioned, the 20 million and the 6 million, those are all straight out of general fund. So we have to ask and ask and ask again, and it doesn't provide the stability that Representative Morgan's talking about. So that's another sticky wicket there. Where is the source of the funding, and can we stabilize it somehow? I don't have any magic answers for that, certainly, but that's an incredibly valid point, Representative Morgan, that we struggle with. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas about how to approach this challenge here?
Rob, I'll just add to the conversation, like in the last, I guess the meeting where this conversation, the subcommittee was created, that there's kind of the two dynamics to be considerate of, right? With all the funding you've talked about to this point, the asks were under what was asked, or, the awards were under what was asked for the existing grantees that are now in place. So the 10 law enforcement and 2 CBOs. None of them received I guess the full amount they requested to complete their or operate through the kind of designated point on that grant, which was December of 2025. So they all ended up on a timeline shorter than anticipated. And then there's the consideration of any enhancements to those programs beyond what they asked for in that last round, or any other programs operating in the state, whether they be CBOs or law enforcement agencies that may require funding. So what we're kind of steaming towards right now, I guess, with all current funding out, is that all of those interests would be competing for just $6 million in July of 2023 as of right now. Right. So I just, to again prong out, there's fulfilling the asks for the sustained operations already in place, and then there's room for any enhancement to those operations or anything new that all need to, I assume, want to be considered in this evaluation.
If we, because you know this budget a heck of a lot more than I do, Ryan, if we theoretically made the current situation the baseline, but also added what we weren't able to fund, essentially what Representative Morgan was referring to. If we had more money, an unlimited amount of money, and we were able to at least fund the needs, what would that look like for a total ask for, would it be 50 million? I mean, what would that number be? I think 50 is probably pretty close, actually, but I don't know what the math actually says.
And Ryan, I'm not sure if you have a more precise amount. I was talking with Alex, our internal budget guy this morning about that. And I think that it's a little bit hard to tell because, for example, the law enforcement that weren't funded in the first round of funding before the legislature was good enough to give us additional monies, we can't just add that ask to the ask that then came later because some of that was fulfilled. But our estimate right now is about $40 million in total ask across all of the applications that we've received that would not be double dipping across those pre-existing grantees is what we were thinking.
Is that in addition to the 6 baseline?
No, that we would say that in total, if we gave out 32 million this year, 40 million was approximately the ask. But I will note though too that, and there was some consternation on the part of some of our potential grantees before they became grantees at the time, that I think that some counties asked for much less than they would have ideally asked for because they knew of the limitation of the funding. So I'd say that 40 would be a floor, certainly. But we would want to work towards additional funding because I know that some counties were making some individual county outlays as well that they would be very happy if the state could help them with.
So 40 is a floor.
I think so.
And that would be, yeah. And so that would be 6 and 33 roughly. I mean, roughly. And that would not include the water masters.
Correct.
So that would be continuing funding there. That's just for the CJC side. What other folks think about that? 40 as a bare minimum on the CJC side and 5 on the Water Resources Department side. I just haven't heard anything from the Water WRD or water masters as to whether the 5 million was adequate, too much, not enough, or what the deal is there. Representative Morgan.
I would say the 40 million for the law enforcement put the CBOs outside of it. So a separate, so water and CBO separate from the 40 million for the law enforcement need.
To give us the additional space to deal with that. So you're proposing 40 as an initial starting recommend, 40 plus the 6, so 46 on the IMM EGP plus the 5 million on the water masters. That actually kind of makes sense to me, just by the rough numbers, because I was thinking 50 in my head and you're at 46, so just based on the needs. But oh, looks like we have Brent. Brent, you got some thoughts?
I actually have a couple questions, but yeah, I think the 46 makes sense. I mean, obviously, if we want to get it figured out for the overall needs and not keep, pinching. I guess I don't totally understand the method of acquiring this, but I would think that makes a lot of sense to try and just get things funded this time and make sure everybody can get what they were trying to get done the first round, and my question would be about geographical funding as far as the water masters go in particular. Is that like spread out throughout the state? And same probably with the law enforcement piece. Is that spread out throughout evenly, or are these focused on areas that are the most issues?
So I can't speak to the water master part. I think it is statewide. Maybe Amanda or Ryan knows more. I just don't know. Maybe we can bring someone in on our next meeting to talk about that, because I've heard about water masters inspecting sites in Clackamas and in Eastern Oregon and in Southwest Oregon. So I'm guessing they've spread it statewide. In terms of the IMM EGP
I
program,
can answer that too, Rob.
Oh, cool. In terms of the IMM EGP program, it's based on the grantees that apply, which are driven by the demand and the needs. So yes, it's statewide, but it's kind of, I would say, heavily focused on Southwest Oregon, with quite a bit of focus up and down the Willamette Valley and a few areas in Eastern Oregon as well. In other words, the places where you'd think people would illegally grow marijuana. Those tend to be the more intense areas of our grantees. But Representative Morgan, you might know more about the WRD, which I know nothing about.
Yeah, the money was sent statewide, and the concern that we should be very intentional in the conversation is that money has to be used for cannabis-related enforcement. Because after the money was allocated, there was word from the department that it could be used for any water enforcement, not just related to the cannabis. And that kind of goes outside of the scope of what this intended funding was for. They have been able to increase across the state, but in staffing, but it is not regionalized, it is statewide.
That was my concern around that. Yeah, I definitely think, especially if we're pulling from the cannabis fund, that we are utilizing it towards the problem and not just, random. So I just echo that for sure.
Actually, that's a great point. However, this last cycle, the 5 million, as I understand it, came out of general fund rather than off of cannabis taxes. But I think the point is equally valid. The 5 million was spent with the intention of ramping up water masters for the illegal diversion of water in the cannabis field. So, okay, so what I've got right now as a potential recommendation to mention to the task force, obviously just starting numbers, on the 21st is $40 million for IMM EGP enforcement, $6 million for IMM EGP victims assistance, and $5 million for WRD for cannabis water enforcement. That's, I think, what we've got on the table now. Anybody else have any thoughts? And again, we'll have to adjust all these numbers moving forward. There's no doubt in my mind. But Ken, thoughts?
Yeah, it's not on the numbers specifically, and maybe this is actually more for Representative Morgan or just the legislators thinking about this issue. I actually completely prefer us to have stable, kind of clearly identified buckets of money for CBOs versus law enforcement. That makes our jobs so much easier. I will say that the way that the legislation, or at least the way that the statute is now constructed after the legislation, it makes it actually, I would say hard, if not impossible, for us to completely parcel that money out that way, because the way that the eligibility is just written in statutorily, it says that basically CBOs and local jurisdictions are eligible for this funding. So it's just a little side note that if we're looking at other legislative changes or fixes just to the all of the statutes related to these programs, that might be something that we actually want to be explicit about by saying that that there is a route for CBOs, there's a route for law enforcement, therefore 40 million to law enforcement, 6 million to CBOs, or whatever it turns out to be. That way we can actually execute the intent that we're talking about here today. I just wanted to make that note.
Yeah, it's a really good point to make. It does kind of open up a potential can of worms of discussion in terms of where your funding sources, because general fund, of course, is just biennial. They give it to you once and you have to beg the next time. Whereas if we did dedicate it off the top of cannabis taxes, that would be more permanent, or at least it would last longer. But the challenge is that would be taking dollars away from other priorities. So that's a big I don't know if this particular subcommittee wants to address the funding source issue other than to just maybe mention. I'm happy to, as kind of quasi chair, to mention what Ken said at the 21st without identifying a specific source, but just reminding folks that a biennial general fund allocation is just that. It's only a biennial general fund allocation.
Well, and I would have to say to address the issue that I just identified, we would not. That could be done regardless of the funding source. I think this is more about just the statement of eligibility that's in statute right now, of trying to parcel those out, just so we know that we have two separate lanes.
Right.
Could be beneficial. That way, we in a sense, if we were looking to parcel things off this time, our ask from the CBOs was just over 6 million. So giving them the 6 million that was passed during the during the short session worked out really smoothly. But we could have. I could foresee grounds for protest, for example, if we received $10 million in ask from CBOs and they point to the statute that says they are eligible for the entire bucket, which is how it's written now. I could see some potential issues there depending on the funding decisions we make. And so it could just be cleaner if we statutorily define separate routes for them. And I'm just mentioning that. I know it's complicating things, but I also don't want us to leave this meeting thinking that we have kind of an agreement on these two separate buckets when we may not statutorily be able to do it just the way it's written now.
Yeah, it was kind of an odd structure that they added to that statute. It kind of needs to be cleaned up. I think it's just because we passed all those bills really quickly. One of them actually, I think, got passed in that one-day special session, and it was just, we put it together fast and we weren't being surgical. So I'm happy to look at that and make some suggestions, or if you want to as well, Ken, that would be great, about how to clean up that statute to make these allocations work. So that actually wouldn't address the underlying issue of where do we get the money from. I don't know if the subcommittee wants to make a recommendation, because that gets really political and it gets really challenging. And I understand. I stated clearly in front of the CJC and others what I think ought to be done with cannabis taxes, which is we ought to spend every dollar making our cannabis programs work right first before we spend it on anything else. But I know others don't agree with that. And so I don't want to get political because of that. But yeah, Ken's got a really valid point. That was kind of a sloppy way of crafting that statute. Is there anything else we want to address today, or does anybody else have any thoughts about, I guess, the opening initial recommendation back to the task force on the 21st, unless folks change it, will be 40 million IMM EGP enforcement, 6 million IMM EGP victims assistance, and 5 million water resources. Does that sound all right to folks? I guess I should ask the other way. Somebody else want to do something different? Nobody's talking. All right. Well, I don't want to use up everybody else's time. If we kind of have a general consensus around these numbers, at least as a starting point, we'll continue this conversation on the 21st. And then if the chair wants us to meet again to further hash through things, we can easily do that as well. Anyone else have any thoughts before I give you back half an hour of your day? Commissioner Morgan, Representative Morgan.
That's kind of funny. But yeah, no, I get it. I guess for me, I'm just curious. We got a lot of people on this meeting, and I don't know many of the names, so I'm just curious who they represent. And it, I'm hoping people be a part of the conversation, not just flies on the wall, kind of seeing what we're about. Right? We need to make sure that we're hearing from everybody, and especially, I mean, I'm vice chair of the task force, so I'm here because we're going to be making some legislative recommendations. And so we need to be intentional of, are we missing anything? Are we not aware of something that needs to be included? Or I just want to encourage that y'all took the time to be here. We do need to hear from you, because Ryan and director and Rob and I are all, and Brett, we talk. So we've been on the other task force meeting, but the rest of you guys aren't part of that full task force meeting. So we definitely want to hear your feedback. So I just want to make sure you have that opportunity, because it is of value.
Indeed. I see Brent's got his hand up, but anyone else on this call, feel free to just raise your hand. We'll take comments from anybody, but go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I just wanted to echo, I think it's what you said about using the cannabis tax money towards getting the industry moving and continuing to improve what we're doing with it. So just wanted to say that. And I think that budget proposal looks good for me moving forward right now, based off of what I'm hearing. So my 2 bits.
Excellent. I'd probably give you 3 bits for that, but that's good. All right. Anybody else have any comments, suggestions, thoughts? Otherwise, we'll call this meeting a day. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I'll be reporting essentially the bottom line that we discussed here to the full task force on the 21st. And if we need to re-meet, which I suspect we may in November or December, as we find out more, I'll send out a note to everybody, or actually Amanda probably will, because she has the ability to call meetings. So, all right. Well, we are adjourned, and everybody have a wonderful week.